Hey, it's Patricia Murphy. It's Monday, and this is Seattle Now. Every 30 seconds, a Latinx person becomes an eligible voter in the U.S. Latinx voters are changing our political landscape, and here in Washington, they make up the largest pool of voters behind white people. In a minute, KUOW's Esmy Jimenez will tell us what issues are top of mind for Latinx voters this election season. But first, let's get you caught up. Bill Gates says additional people will die of COVID-19 unless we improve our ability to test for the virus. Gates was on Meet the Press Sunday. He said the U.S. is running the worst testing system of any country. One of the state's passenger ferries is out of service after being struck by lightning. The MV Puyallup was near the dock during a run between Edmonds and Kingston when it was hit Saturday. The strike impacted the Puyallup's navigation system, and the ferry is docked for now. And UW Medicine and Fred Hutch are recruiting patients to study an antibody cocktail to prevent COVID-19. The drug from Regeneron Pharmaceuticals is a cocktail of two mononuclear antibodies. It's also being used to treat people who are already infected, namely President Trump when he was being treated for COVID-19. Latinos are an influential voter bloc in the U.S. They're the biggest minority group in the country and in Washington. But it's a group that has a complicated relationship with politics and voting. KUOW immigration reporter Esmy Jimenez is reporting on the Latino vote in Washington for a special series. Hey, Esmy.
Hey, Trish. How's it going?
Good. Thank you so much for taking the time. I wanted to start by talking about how people with Latin American heritage identify themselves. I have heard Latino or Latinx, and I'm from the East Coast, and people I grew up with identified themselves as Hispanic. So how should we think about these identifiers?
That is such a good question. Honestly, I tend to use the word that my sources use, and I would also say that for the most part, people tend to use their nationality to identify themselves more than anything. So they'll say like, soy boricua, I'm colombiano, I'm Mexican. You know, in certain places, like you said, yeah, on the West Coast, I feel like we say Latina, Latino, Latinx being the gender neutral version. I would say, too, that when you hear me say Hispanic, especially later on, when it comes to a lot of statistics, that ends up happening because the federal government, a lot of the census data, that's how they identify this big population of people, despite the different identities that kind of come up at those intersections. So it's a messy answer, but it's kind of where we're at right now.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that up about the government using the term Hispanic, because as I was listening to you just now, I realized I don't know if my friends identified themselves as Hispanic. I know they were identified as Hispanic. So an important distinction. Thank you for that. Mm-hmm. And we're also talking about a huge culturally diverse group of people, not only different countries of origin, but generationally very different as well. What does the Latino demographic look like here in Washington?
Yeah, so let's crack that monolith. Here in Washington, we got about 1 million Latinos. They're about, I think, 12 to 13% of the population. Most of them are Mexican-American. But then you also have pockets of Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, and I think people from El Salvador. A lot of times people will be like, oh, I thought, Latinos were mostly in Florida, New York, Texas, and they absolutely are. But Washington is actually among the top 15 states with Latino populations, and it's growing quickly, especially if you go east of the mountains. You go to Yakima County, a couple different other ones up there. There's a whole congressional district that is 1 in 4 of those voters is actually Hispanic. So the Latino vote very much can matter and should matter.
That is fascinating, Esmy. So what do we know about how Latinos in Washington tend to vote?
So, one, we know Latinos historically have voted heavily Democrat. So about 2 out of 3 usually do. In the last election, though, you can notice that 1 in 3 did vote for Trump nationally. The other thing is that Latina women actually tend to vote Democrat more than their male counterparts. When it comes to voter turnout and then the number of Latinos that actually register is on the lower side. So in 2016, less than half came out to vote. And this is where some politicians will say, like, listen, the sleeping giant of Latinos needs to wake up if it wants to be acknowledged.
Yeah. What is the issue? Is it disillusionment? Is it people not talking to them directly? Why is that?
I think there's a couple different things going on. One of the first that I will say is you have to remember that for some of these folks, there's this idea that politicians are always corrupt, right? The government is always corrupt. You can't really change anything. You can't really trust them. So some people back home, especially in like Venezuela, Colombia, and Mexico, they had this feeling, right, and for very good reasons, that the government wasn't working successfully. So once they come to the U.S., sure, a lot of things have changed. But depending on their status and depending on their engagement, they might feel like their vote still doesn't matter. So I've noticed that some of the younger generation has kind of inherited this belief. One of the things that I've also noted is that this feeling is validated by the reality that politicians don't always earn the Latino vote. And what happens is that I talk to voters and they say, it starts feeling inauthentic, like you only come visit me when it's an election year. And then we end up with these chicken and egg dilemmas where politicians don't engage Latinos, so they don't show up to the polls. Then they're not written into any policies. They're not prioritized. So they say, hey, this politician didn't actually show up for me. And then the cycle continues.
In your reporting, what did you hear from Latino voters about what is important to them during this election?
Yes. So for every 30 seconds, this collaborative project, I've been following Michelle Aguilar Ramirez. She just turned 18 last month in September. And I've been following her for what's going to be a year in total. And she cares about climate change and labor issues and immigration for sure. Especially young folks, they're the ones pushing their parents on topics like climate change, saying like, hey, this is important. We need to figure this out now. And originally she was for Bernie Sanders when he was still running, but now she plans on casting her vote for Biden, even though it's her first election and she's still a little lukewarm about him, but she thinks it's important for her to get in line.
Esmy, COVID is having a disproportionate impact on Latino voters in Washington. They are more likely to get infected than white people. They are 7 times more likely to be hospitalized and 3 times more likely to die. How is this impacting people's votes?
It's at the top of their voting concerns. So the polling firm Latino Decisions published new findings last month on Latinos and where they're at right now. One question asked them, what are the most important issues that you want for the next president to address? 40% of those who answered, they said responding to coronavirus, right? Figure out COVID-19. Next to that was lowering the cost of healthcare. And then third was improving wages and dealing with unemployment. But people, the first thing that they want is they're like, how are we going to fix this pandemic? This is completely destroying the Latino community. What is going to happen? And Trish, especially, I don't know if you remember the images that were going on when there was wildfire smoke. You ended up seeing these farm workers who, of course, had a mask because of COVID, but then there was the smoke. And so you saw people still working in the fields. And I think a lot of Latinos saw those images, even if they weren't working directly. And they said, hey, those are my people out there. They're working really hard for the rest of us. So what are we going to do? If we can work from home, what are we going to do to protect them, the frontline workers?
So COVID and the effects of the pandemic are clearly very important to these voters. I wonder how politicians in Washington are reaching out to voters and what you're seeing that seems to work.
Mm-hmm. I think politicians, even at the national level, are still figuring out that if they want to get certain Latino populations to come out, they have to do it authentically and way before it's election season. So, for example, with the Bernie Sanders campaign, back in 2016, he was one of the few candidates that came to Yakima, right, where they have a big Latino population. Other candidates, maybe they would speak Spanish on stage, but a lot of people interpret that as hispandering, kind of pandering to Latino voters with one-time actions, and it's just, it's interpreted as being inauthentic.
That's fascinating. I'm sorry, right? Hispandering is fascinating.
Yes, do you remember Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio? And they were both speaking in Spanish to each other, being like, who can speak Spanish better? And it was a mess.
Oh, my gosh. That's so messy. That's so messy, Esmy.
Now between Biden and Trump, I think the Biden campaign is catching up, trying to make sure they really nail down the Latino vote in places like Arizona and Florida. But back in Washington, one of the things that I try to remind people is you're definitely seeing Latinos step up, and specifically Latinas, right? So right now we have Jamie Herrera Butler. She's a Latina Republican serving in the House of Representatives. In the state, we have Representative Lillian Ortiz Self. We have Monica Stonier, Rebecca Saldaña. On city council, we have 3 more Latinas. So they are absolutely stepping up to lead the communities. And I think that's fascinating because I've always thought about the question about the sleeping giant, The sleeping giant doesn't jump. It needs to be woken up and it needs to be engaged. That's how you motivate a community. And the other thing is that because it's not a monolith, it's not really one sleeping giant, right? It's 12 because of all the nationalities that you have, all the age groups that you have, the geographies that you have. So you need to actually invest in making sure those communities know what you're doing, that they feel like you're actually working with them, and that you follow up with that.
No better definition of all politics is local, Esmy. So good to talk to you. Thanks so very much for your time.
Thank you.
Esmy Jimenez is KUOW's immigration reporter. If you want to hear the story she did with Michelle for every 30 seconds, there's a link in the show notes. Seattle Now is produced by Clare McGrane, Sophie Reed, Caroline Chamberlain Gomez, and Jason Pagano. Matt Jorgensen does our music. I'm Patricia Murphy. See you tomorrow.